The moment she placed my hand on her waist, every thought in my head disappeared. We had been best friends for years, the kind of friends who could finish each other's sentences, laugh at the same stupid memories, and sit together in complete silence without feeling uncomfortable. But that night was different. We were stranded in a tiny mountain guesthouse after a storm had blocked the roads, and there was only one bed left. She had smiled nervously and said sharing a bed was no big deal. I tried to believe her. Then, in the darkness, she reached for my hand and gently placed it around her waist. My heart started pounding, not because I was afraid of being close to her, but because I suddenly realized I was terrified of what that closeness might mean. Before we continue, if stories about friendship, second chances, hidden feelings, and unexpected moments touch your heart, please take a second to like this video, share it with someone who might enjoy it, leave a comment, and subscribe to Ripple of Kindness for more emotional stories about second chances. Her name was Emma, and for almost 10 years, she had been the person I trusted more than anyone. We met in college when both of us were struggling to find our place in a world that seemed determined to make us feel insignificant. Somehow, we became inseparable. We celebrated birthdays together, supported each other through failed relationships, stayed up all night before important exams, and eventually watched our lives move in completely different directions without allowing the distance between us to weaken our friendship. There had always been something special about Emma, but I had carefully placed that feeling into a box labeled friendship because opening it felt too dangerous. I was terrified that if I admitted I wanted more, I could lose the one person who had never walked away from me. Emma had recently gone through a painful breakup. Her fiancé had left her only weeks before their wedding, claiming that he needed a different life. She tried to pretend she was fine, but I knew her well enough to see the cracks behind every smile. She stopped answering messages, avoided family gatherings, and began blaming herself for everything that had gone wrong. I became the person she called when the nights felt too long. I never tried to fix her. I simply stayed. One Friday, she asked me to accompany her on a short trip to a cabin she had booked months earlier. She said she needed to escape the city and clear her head. I agreed immediately. Neither of us expected the weather to turn against us. By evening, heavy snow had covered the mountain road, and the small guest house where we stopped was nearly empty. The owner apologized and told us only one room remained available. When we entered, we discovered a small table, a fireplace, and one narrow bed. Emma looked at me and laughed awkwardly. She said we had survived worse things together and that sharing a bed was no big deal. I smiled, pretending my heart hadn't suddenly started beating faster. We had shared hotel rooms before, but there had always been separate beds. This felt different. Maybe because she was different now. Maybe because I was finally beginning to understand feelings I had spent years hiding. That night, we talked for hours. The fire slowly died, and the room became quiet except for the wind pressing against the windows. Emma told me she was afraid she would never trust anyone again. She said she sometimes wondered whether something was wrong with her because people she loved always seemed to leave. I wanted to tell her that she had never been the problem. I wanted to tell her that someone had been standing beside her for years, quietly loving every imperfect part of her. But fear held the words inside me. Eventually, we turned off the lights. We lay on opposite sides of the bed with a careful distance between us. I stared at the ceiling, listening to her breathing. I thought she was asleep until she suddenly moved closer. I felt her hand searching beneath the blanket. Then she found mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. She gently lifted my hand and placed it around her waist. My entire body froze. She whispered that she was cold, but something in her voice made me wonder if that was really the reason. I could feel her breathing change. I could feel my own heartbeat pounding against my chest. Yet I didn't move my hand away. I simply stayed there, afraid that one wrong movement could destroy something we had spent a decade building. After a few minutes, she quietly asked whether I had ever wondered what would happen if we had met under different circumstances. I didn't answer immediately. The question felt like a door opening into a room I had been afraid to enter. I finally admitted that I had wondered about it more times than I could count. The silence that followed was more powerful than any confession. The next morning, everything felt strangely normal. Emma made coffee while I watched the snow outside. Neither of us mentioned what had happened. I convinced myself that perhaps the night had only been about comfort and loneliness. She was vulnerable after her breakup, and I didn't want to take advantage of that vulnerability. But when we returned home, something had changed. Emma started calling more often. She remembered small things I had forgotten telling her. She sent me pictures during ordinary moments, asked about my day, and sometimes stared at me for a second too long before looking away. Still, I refused to assume anything. I had seen what heartbreak could do to her, and I wasn't willing to confuse emotional dependence with love. Then, one evening, she invited me to dinner. The restaurant was the same place where we had celebrated our 10th anniversary as friends. Halfway through the meal, Emma reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her eyes were nervous, but this time there was no sadness behind them. She explained that the night at the guesthouse had forced her to face something she had been avoiding for years. She realized that when she imagined her future, I was always there. Not as a friend standing somewhere in the background, but as the person she wanted beside her when life became difficult, when things became beautiful, and when ordinary days were all she had. I listened without interrupting. Then I told her the truth I had hidden for nearly a decade. I had loved her for years. Not because she was perfect, but because she wasn't. I loved the way she laughed when she was embarrassed, the way she became stubborn when she cared about something, and the way she always noticed when someone else was hurting. I loved her before I knew what to call it, and I had stayed silent because losing her friendship seemed worse than living with an unspoken love. Emma cried. Not the broken kind of crying I had seen after her breakup, but the kind that comes when someone finally realizes they have been searching for something that was already standing beside them. She reached across the table and held my hand. There was no dramatic kiss, no perfect movie ending, and no promise that everything would suddenly become easy. We both understood that changing a friendship into something deeper came with risks. We had years of history to protect, fears to overcome, and wounds that still needed time to heal. But for the first time, we weren't pretending. Months passed, and we learned how to become something new without forgetting who we had been. Emma slowly rebuilt her confidence. I learned to stop hiding behind fear. We discovered that love wasn't always about dramatic gestures or perfect moments. Sometimes love was simply staying when someone was afraid, listening when they couldn't find the words, and giving someone enough time to believe they deserved happiness again. The night she placed my hand around her waist had seemed like a small moment at first. But it became the moment that changed everything. It reminded us that some feelings don't arrive suddenly. Sometimes they grow quietly for years, hidden beneath friendship, loyalty, and fear. If this story touched your heart, please support the video by liking it, sharing it with someone you care about, and subscribing to Ripple of Kindness. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need a reminder that second chances can appear in the most unexpected places. And before you leave, comment, "Some love begins as friendship," if you believe the person standing beside you today might someday become the person you never want to live without. Because sometimes the person we are afraid to love is the very person who has been teaching us what love feels like all along.